So thank you so much for being here, Larry. And please share your screen and your talk, and we're anxious to hear it.
Okay.
And before you get started, let me just remind you that if you're not the speaker, please mute yourself.
Well, thank you, Susie, and thank you, Jack. This talk is about how the saguaro became the thing that you think about when you think about the American West. And by iconography, I mean strong defining images like this Harper's cover from 1864, and memorable associations like this slightly out of kilter paint by number of window rock. The impressions that you've been accumulating since you were a little kid in your head, and that you can add to anytime, anywhere, particularly now in our visual culture today, in which we're steeped in events that aspire to a certain viral quality, like this recent New York holiday window that neatly ties up in a single frame my interests in advertising history and the American Southwest. But tonight, I want to turn the clock back to where saguaro iconography began, pretty much in the Gila River Valley. So our time frame begins with the botanical explorers of the mid-19th century and runs through the travel and tourism boosters of the mid to late 20th century, who pictured the saguaro as a welcoming symbol of fun in the sun, leisure, and recreation. So my method is really from the object or the photograph out. The talk is historical. The method of selecting and choosing what to talk about is closer to art, or perhaps the creation of an exhibit, which always begins with something interesting to look at and to think about. Or as one of my late museum friends used to say, kicks your brain into gear. So let's go. My story begins with this particular magazine cover that I found in a used bookstore in Washington, D.C. During my post-Arizona student days in the mid-70s, the 1970s. And I found this after I'd spent time here with the plant, but not quite in this way. And I mean, I'm looking at this and wondering, where did this come from? The date of the magazine is 1950. It's completely published in black and white. And it's a kind of an annual survey riding around the state with some guest ranch advertising attached to it. And I now know that the photographer is Tucson's own Ray Manley, who was just then starting out in professional life as a guest ranch photographer. It's a successful photo. I mean, I stopped and picked it up. But on second thought, though, I'm wondering, like, what happened to the spines? And the way that Manley frames his model in the arms of a saguaro is the heart of the matter. It's an interesting choice for a magazine cover. The way the headline is splashed across it, it's a stand-in for all of Arizona. And the way that he's composed this, it's hardly possible to get closer to the plant. So it's ironic that the root of the saguaro's success as an icon of the West lies in the mistaken assumptions that people have picked up over the years about where its native habitat actually is, represented here by these little smartphone type emojis, which lately have been doing all the heavy lifting for cactus iconography. The map is by artist Paul Maroka, and it's based on information published a couple of years ago by David Yetman. But it's in the accumulation of other images that challenge, that push out and take liberties with this habitat. And that is the imagined habitat, which is up here in your head. And to me, this is an interesting and playful thing, this out of habitat encroachment of the plant. But let's face it, the saguaros have had a lot of help, perhaps more than you can imagine. There's a long, long history of attempted transplantation and propagation of saguaros in California, and exhibitions at railroad stations, most of the Southern Pacific stations from Texas to California, and World's Fairs, all of which happened well before saguaros enjoyed the comfort and protection of light and glass conservatories. This one is the Phipps in Pittsburgh, where they had to be indoors to protect them from the smoky city. But you could have seen them in hothouses from St. Louis to New York and England. And this one happens to be a private collection in Mersey in 1901. So what I'm going to talk about are the early influential published images dating to the plant's botanical discovery in the 1840s, followed by public displays that created uncertainty about the plant's habitat that really laid the foundation for its coming success as a Western symbol. Picturing Arizona, the Saguaro pictures that the travel and tourism industry developed and propagated. And finally, the Tucson-based campaign of viral photographs that took liberties with the plant, circling back to that Ray Manley image, literally in the arms of Saguaros. So first up, the published images from the era of botanical discovery. The first cactus specimens from the New World to be exhibited in the Old were not saguaros, but rather large barrels. These were exported from the interior of Mexico through the port of Veracruz and exhibited at Kew Gardens in 1846. And there were actually a couple of these, and they didn't last. They would be taken out of the hills by ox cart. In the exhibition of a Sirius senilis in 1847, however, anticipated the exhibition of columnar saguaro specimens in botanical gardens later. But back in the Gila River Valley, this is the earliest surviving sketch that I know of the armed and branched plant. And the sketch was made by Lieutenant William Helmsley Emery in 1848. And Emery was the head of the Army Reconnaissance Party charged with exploring the flattest, most expeditious route to California from the Kansas Territory in the era of the Mexican War. And it took him right through the Gila River Valley. And while Lieutenant Emery is a well-known figure, having published his survey through the US Congress, the sketch is hardly known at all, even among historians. He's doing this from memory in a letter to his friend, the botanist George Engelmann, who's begging Engelmann to please classify this plant, give it a botanical name for his soon-to-be published survey. So he's on a kind of a tight frame deadline. So based on Emery's sketch, this little sketch, and assorted cactus bits and parts that Engelmann had around him in St. Louis, he named it Sirius giganteus. And I won't linger on this too much longer, but if you were to ask to draw the plant, someone asked you to draw a saguaro, the sketch that Emery made is kind of what you might come up with. But of course, if you were reading along in Emery's letter, he can't remember if it has spines or not. So the new name appears with the published image in Emery's Reconnaissance in 1848. And the lithograph presented the saguaro as a tree and was based on the drawing by an artist in Emery's party, Mr. John McStanley, that had bypassed Engelmann and gone straight to the lithographer. And I like looking at these exploring party saguaro pictures, most of them that come with figures of people that are introduced for scale, but the people are often reduced in proportion to the plants, which make the plants appear to be even more dramatic as discoveries. It never really became an issue or a question until a lot of people had actually seen the plants in the flesh. It's sort of interesting that they keep doing this. This is a second foray in publishing by Emery some 10 years later, with a completely different set of artists and engravers. And, you know, a more realistic rendering of the fruit harvest appeared in this travel account that was published by the German explorer Julius Froebel, who traveled the Gila River Valley in the early 1850s. A US boundary survey party put into the field in 1850, and this was the second survey that Emery actually completed, but was begun by the artist John Russell Bartlett, contributed this pen and ink wash by Bartlett. In the waning days of Bartlett's tenure as survey head in 1852, Bartlett and his party climbed the foothills of the present-day area of Sentinel Peak in Tucson. And you can see Tucson, the city, in the distance there. You can also see the old convento down in the valley and the city beyond. But for our purposes here, what you also see are members of Bartlett's party at leisure, relaxing, taking in the landscape. The social setting of people in the company of plants would become increasingly familiar among collectors, health seekers, and boosters in the years to come. In 1880, the production of Saguaro pictures took an exponential leap when the railroad arrived at Tucson from California. As a consequence, saguaros soon made the return trip to California, where they were transplanted in gardens that in turn appeared in pictures in the press. The leading example was the Arizona garden at the new Hotel Del Monte on the Monterey Peninsula, all the way out on the coast. The hotel, basically a Southern Pacific operation, opened in 1882. The print appeared in Harper's in 1887. Note that the saguaros are columnar, not armed or branched, which would have complicated their removal. And also note the collar-like braces that they're sporting, used for support. And as you certainly know, it's quite possible for a saguaro to cheat death and bloom for years in or out of the ground. The Southern Pacifics demonstrated capacity, their ability to remove saguaros from the Sonoran Desert led to displays at passenger stations from Los Angeles to San Antonio. This is the Los Angeles station here. So their ambiguity is being built, a passenger and a postcard at a time, about the saguaro's place along a well-traveled and highly visible rail line, and suggests how it became a fixture in the imagination of a new and ever-popular West. The sender of this postcard, for example, who apparently came from Ohio, wrote, "This is the picture of the depot at which I arrived in coming to San Antonio, and the cactus was brought here from New Mexico, and as you can see, is a giant." Transplanted saguaros died in Texas just as they did in Monterey. This colorized postcard pictures the Arizona garden saguaros at the height of its display. Note that the braces on the plants have been colorized. Successive pictures of the same area show the decline of the saguaro population. Here they're fewer, smaller, and they have no braces. And finally, there are none. The garden's succulents and palms labored on without them. And there were many more examples of saguaros lingering in California that I could show you, but unlike the Del Monte, there are no pictures to show, of course, what no longer exists. And I hope that you can tell that this is a collage. It's a playful kind of a paste up, and it's called, these are known as tall tale postcards, where they sometimes picture fruit, exaggerated produce, and things going to market that kind of celebrate in a playful way the fecundity of the soil, the climate, and so forth. And it's a playful conceit. You can see the title along the bottom there, "The Things Grow Large in California." And the appearance of such a card as this one is significant. So to get the joke, for it to even work, you have to be familiar enough with the plants to know, for example, that the scale is playfully out of whack. Though the saguaros lingered before failing in California, their pictures remained in circulation for years. And by the end of the 1880s, many individuals had taken up cactus collecting, some personally venturing into the field, while others traded in the simple pleasures of a small succulent garden or perhaps a pot on a windowsill. Philadelphia nurseryman Albert Blank advertised cactus collecting as a hobby for all. Blank offered Sirius giganteus, king of the cactus family, and you can see one here in the top display in the center, king of the cactus family, from 6 inches for $1.50 to 6 feet tall for $50. That same year, in 1889, the Baltimore Cactus Society gets organized and holds what its leaders promoted as the first Cactus Exhibition in America in 1893. Now, this society was just novel enough to attract the attention of the press, and Harper's rendered it as a social event surrounded by pictures of the giant cactus of the Gila River Valley. The Society published the first cactus journal in America, whose second issue featured a photograph of its outdoor display. Members lent plants for the summer and retrieved them in the fall. The display featured rockwork parterres, yes, that's a word, radiating from a central saguaro, pretty much like that blank ad. The display was covered and uncovered to protect it from rain. In St. Louis, philanthropist Henry Shaw turned his private estate into a public garden. The garden continued after Shaw's death in 1898 as a leader in botanical research and Victorian display values. Two columnar saguaros flank the garden's gated portico in a formal arrangement worthy of Versailles. Shaw's outdoor displays occupied 150 garden laborers who moved the plants in and out of the safety of their winter hothouses. And you notice in these pictures, these plants are all in pots, and presumably the saguaros are potted as well, hence their easy movement in and out of the ground for the winter. This picture documents a recent arrival being uncrated, and it's going to go right through those doors into the palm house. And it looks what appears to me to be creosote padding it out. And this is about 1914. This is a photograph of a fully armed transplanted saguaro, the first armed saguaro that I have a picture of. And here it is at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. So this is the seminal World's Fair of architect Daniel Burnham and White City fame. And it was excavated near Tucson and transported to the fairgrounds courtesy of the Southern Pacific. Tucson theater owner William Reed arranged for the collection to be sent to Chicago. And I have a couple of cyanotypes pulling back from this building and looking to your right. And here's another view that showed the cactus garden mounted in front of the horticulture building, which appears to be in a kind of a linear sand pile. And from that same corner, pulling back, a stereo view simply described as the Great Cactus. And you can see what appeared to be little green agaves around filling out the base of the display. Meanwhile, over at the fair's territorial building, the display featured a crestate saguaro. And while you can again note the brace and one that's missing on the plant closer to the building, what's interesting is the way that you see people posing with the plants for photos. And for many, this has got to be their first experience, which kind of is what the fair and World's Fairs were all about. That is the presentation of things in the ultimate, with the ultimate in display techniques. Now, you might think that the dissemination of pictures, beginning with survey reports, transplants, pictures, and woodcuts and harpers, postcards, and stereo views, would create to a kind of an upward trajectory in awareness and popularity in proportion to new knowledge gained about the saguaro. And you would think that this would be just a straight, solid curve, as I assumed it might be when I started out with my work. It is an upward curve, to be sure, but it's hardly smooth at all. A Chicago World's Fair from Arizona, for example, complained that the leaders of the territory had lost the opportunity to erect, quote, a statue of abundance with a horn of plenty in each hand, instead of the withered and forbidding cactus stock erected to indicate, we presume, the poverty of Arizona's soil. Now, just let that sink in for a minute. So don't think of this upward curve as a smooth curve. Rather, it's more like a crescent shape, it's a kind of a sawtooth blade up and down, which is kind of an apt metaphor for where the plants headed, into the turn of the century. And I mean, whether the saguaro appears or not in pictures and photographs about the territory, all depends upon who's calling the shots, who's deciding for Arizona, what gets pictured, how it's pictured, which is to say, how it's framed and presented within and without the territory. So in the matter of dramatizing this particular vision and making it stick, with the turn of the century, any number of slides, transparencies, and stereo view cards picture the changes taking place under irrigation from crops to parks. So here's a stereo view of an alfalfa harvest. Now, there's no economic reason for the plants to be saved other than the cost of labor and the expense of a rather thorny and time-consuming removal. Cacti, large and small, figured as the casualties of irrigation when pictured at all. And this state of affairs did little to advance the iconography of the saguaro beyond its three-dimensional novelty as a stereo view subject. An early set aside parkland in Phoenix, the Papago Saguaro National Monument, devolved from the wilderness it might have been, and postcards of the park's most popular geological formation, the hole in the rock, show the saguaro forest yielding to the irrigated features of a public park. And the first card is 1922. The second card is 1936. And they actually got an easement and brought in a canal. And this had the unintended consequence of having the designation of a national monument taken away, and it was eventually given to the area that's now Saguaro East, or Saguaro National Park East in Tucson. But of course, the geological formation remains and is there today that can be seen. So with the coming of the 20th century, you have a kind of dip in this arc, but it never really goes down too far. In fact, the way I see it, the saguaro achieves a kind of parity or a standoff, at least in terms of the territory's quasi-official promotional imagery directed to the attention of would-be immigrants and investors, simply because the saguaro is there as a regional identifier. So if you have, say, a picture of a prospector, a pickaxe, and a fir tree, to balance it out in subdominant kind of north-south arrangement, you also have a rancher, a horse, and a saguaro. Now this is anecdotal information to be sure, but the same tensions are exhibited in the design of Arizona's territorial seal and the shifting over to the state seal, the official seal adopted on the eve of statehood in 1912. The territorial seal acknowledged the saguaro by tipping it in, like that tall tale postcard I just showed you, seen here in the foothills of the San Francisco peaks north of Flagstaff, which, if you're keeping score, is north of the Sonoran Desert. The state seal of 1912, which is unchanged and used today, pictures a storage reservoir, irrigated fields, a miner with a pickaxe and a shovel, and a steer representing cattle. The state seal hardly settled the question of the saguaro's place by erasing it. And if you stand back and look at this for a minute, the irony is palpable. You have the formal Arizona gardens for California as a statement that things grow large, including saguaros, while Arizona's state seal would have it that things grow large except saguaros. The state of affairs created a natural dilemma for Arizona's tourism industry, which was just starting to get off the ground. Now, to be fair, even in Tucson, there was an ambivalence about the saguaro's place in promoting the city as a winter destination. In 1922, for example, the first pamphlets of the Sunshine Climate Club emphasized trees and lawns greet you on arrival. And when the Chamber of Commerce published pamphlets for the outside world, shady streets and residential architecture, which, as seen here, might have been anywhere, was the norm, at least for now. This attitude persisted for decades, despite desert study financed by the Carnegie Institution of Washington, D.C. In its publicity, the saguaro took a star turn, beginning with the construction of the building. Citing the new building among the plants was of great importance, and this has been a constant ever since. It's also consistent with the way that Saguaro became the focus of publicity about the laboratory research. In 1902, just to back up for a minute, the year before the laboratory, the leaders of the New York Botanical Garden put an expedition into the field to collect what director Nathaniel Lord Britton described as quote unquote interesting things for their new conservatories that they were building in the Bronx. Garden botanist Daniel Tremblay McDougall, who would later become the director of the Desert Laboratory, collected columnar saguaros and other succulents for the garden in southern Arizona and Mexico. Seen here are his crated specimens at Torres, Mexico in 1902 at the railroad. McDougall returned to southern Arizona the following year in 1903, this time to scout locations for the laboratory underwritten by garden board member Andrew Carnegie. McDougall collected a second accession of plants, also crated and delivered from Torres, but this shipment was damaged somewhat in transit to New York. Planted in pots and carefully braced, the columnar saguaros collected by McDougall from 1902 to 1903 bloomed here for the camera in the New York Botanical Garden in 1905. George Engelmann's Cereus giganteus name stood as the saguaro's botanical name for nearly 50 years until garden director Nathaniel Lord Britton and the Smithsonian's Joseph Nelson Rose changed it to Carnegiea gigantea to honor the Desert Laboratory's patron, Carnegie, who apparently learned of the honor while visiting the laboratory at Tucson. He was said to have been disappointed at his associates' pandering, and neither photographs nor press accounts documenting Carnegie's visit to Tucson can be found today. The name stuck, confirmed in publicity that leaked out about the name change in 1909, and later in Britton and Rose's monumental work, the Cactaceae. Botanical illustrator Mary Emily Eaton rendered the artwork for this color plate seen here at the New York Botanical Garden. This is the original art that Eaton rendered while in residence at the garden in 1912, according to a light pencil annotation that I'm going to zoom in here in the top margin of the print of the, of the artwork. It says that McDougall collected the saguaro in 1903, and this is the same trip in which he scouted desert laboratory locations. And here's a close-up that shows you Eaton's signature in the lower right. Now, I want to shift now to the upbuilding of Southern Arizona's travel and tourism industry and the role its leaders played in overcoming, or at least sidestepping, let's call them entrenched interests that continued to shape what Arizona looked like and talked about when it talked to the outside world. It was a long climb from irrigated fields and orange groves and so forth to alternative pictures and photo publicity that celebrated native plants. This natural dilemma had long confounded the state's boosters, who ever since the 19-teens and 20s had made incidental use of the plant. But by the late 1940s, their literature had begun to move the saguaro from the margins to the center of the frame. When faced with the dilemma about whether or how to use native plants in their promotional materials, many institutions, from cities to passenger railroads, deployed the malleable arts of commercial illustration to reframe the destination. For example, you might put a saguaro on the back panel of the fold, as on this Mesa brochure cover, or you might boldly place it on the front and be done with it. And here, horseback riders appear in front of a flowering saguaro. A flowering yucca spans the critical fold down the center. By 1950, even the Santa Fe Railroad, which runs through Flagstaff, has gotten into the act, rendering a saguaro using the railroad's signature New Mexico palette of purple shadows made familiar in its Grand Canyon and Indian detour publicity. On this one, the saguaro straddles the fold right down the center. It was Arizona's guest ranch owners who softened up the saguaro as a welcoming symbol, a profound change from the days of territorial land sales propaganda and a state seal design that wrote off native plants entirely. In their literature exemplified here, you can't get close enough. You're beginning to climb into the plant. The way that guest ranch owners picture it, the saguaro is a natural attraction that you relax with, get cozy with, and cuddle up with. And you can even sleep with it. Guest ranch publicity is the spark of a social saguaro framed for creative leisure, relaxation, or my favorite, simple stare out the window contemplation. And there's quite a bit of this stare out the window stuff going on. The advertising agency partnership of Ernest Cabot and Norval Gill, created in 1945, interpreted the saguaro as a freestanding artwork. Cabot and Gill favored the frame technique in graphic designs for a long list of hospitality clients whose brochures folded the viewer's attention right back into the subject at hand. Their logo exemplified the technique, picturing an artist holding a framed saguaro picture at arm's length, comparing it to the full-size plant itself in a frame. The firm's artwork deployed window frames in their brochures to similar effect. For Tucson's Lazy K Bar Guest Ranch, or simply the Lazy K, Cabot Gill created brochures whose largest graphic element was the picture window in the ranch's lounge. Pictured in successive brochures over the years, the room's furnishings changed along with the ranch's owners, who moved around and got older, but the saguaro in the room's window is the constant feature around which ranch life is staged. Among enthusiasts of the compositional frame of cactus specimens and gardens, the photographers Charles and Lillian Herbert built their desert home with a picture window that looked out on a massive chandelier-type saguaro, not only to live with, but to contemplate the Catalinas, and a prop whose outstretched arms became a welcoming metaphor that turned the desert into a living social stage for leisure, relaxation, and recreation. Described in perennial syndicated features as the view with a room, the Herbert's living room window framed the most carefully curated saguaro moment in all of Southern Arizona. Though citing a home with a scenic view was not new, in the Herbert's understanding of what was important, the saguaro was the critical element. Over the years, the Herberts amortized the cost of the home's construction with illustrated feature articles about it, syndicating stories picturing the view seen here as late as 1947. And just continuing into this, here's another scene that they staged visiting school teachers on vacation. Focusing on that massive chandelier saguaro, Herbert often photographed people with hobbies doing things for articles. And here he's photographing the final stages of miniature desert diorama production in his backyard ramada here, where he posed the Guy Wellington Knopf family painting Catalina mountain backdrops on concave cardboard shells and bringing each scene to life with natural grasses and tiny, tiny clay saguaros. And Herbert deployed the majestic flowering chandelier saguaro as a slightly out of focus backdrop. And the forced perspective of the road receding into the Catalinas rendered a pleasing facsimile of the Sonoran Desert under glass framed with saguaro ribs. In a 20-year run from the 1930s to the mid-1950s, the Knopf family oversaw the production of 80,000 souvenir dioramas that hung on walls and homes from Maine to California and beyond. So now we've arrived from the irrigated margins of the desert, and I want to talk a little bit about certain photographs which you may have become familiar. But first, there is always a little backstory. In 1922, Tucson Sunshine Climate Club organized to fund a community advertising campaign to promote the city's winter climate. Ads prepared by a Los Angeles advertising agency soon appeared in national magazines and newspapers. Each ad featured a coupon to clip and fill out. The coupon campaign was actually a clever way to compile the names and addresses of prospective visitors who might become new residents. And they would actually track these people out, down and out, and they were able to claim that they knew, people who had purchased homes that had been become interested by, first exposure to this campaign, to demonstrate the value of their agency's work to the client, the Sunshine Climate Club. And the coupon was a kind of a gimme. It had offered a free booklet, dangled the prospect of a free booklet picturing the city and its surroundings that acknowledged its desert setting. The campaign was effective, but it was expensive and was allowed to drop off, to the regret of the advertising agency, in the Depression during the early 1930s. Now, in 1939, Sunshine Climate Club President Roy Drachman, seen here in his shiny rodeo parade shirt, and photographer Charles Herbert of window fame, set out to create viral photographs to promote Tucson in lieu of a paid advertising campaign. The most well-known and widely reproduced photograph was the cactus bikini or cactus sun suit that appeared in some 300 newspapers across the nation and around the world, culminating a year later with a full-page story in Life magazine, for which Drachman and Herbert restaged the shoot. Though they did not use the word viral, that was the intent, to create photographs that would find their way into newspapers and magazines without the expense of an ad agency. They called them gags, gag photographs. Though Drachman and subsequent club leaders never dropped the ad agency, the agency wouldn't allow it, gag photo publicity could run concurrently with advertising if and when the club chose to return to it, which it eventually did in 1950. And I'll show you an example in a minute. But the effect of this particular gag photo, the Cactus Sun Suit, as attention-getting as it was off-putting. When it appeared in the papers over which Drachman and company had no control, the editors of the papers typically gave it a headline or a byline that said, "Touch me not." So the original gag of sewing up and wearing plant parts soon led to less invasive poses. It was much easier to pose models sitting in, on, and around or framed by the plants, as if in a window. So here is one of Manley and an assistant, Ray Manley, an assistant, posing a model on a ladder. And the caption for this one actually explains the premise of the gag and how it's done, which was another kind of device that was used, explaining that the ladder is padded, the model's not actually seated on the plant, and so forth. But here's another one with a high school model in a bathing suit posing on one of the legacy plants that I believe this is in Saguaro East, but we're really not sure exactly where many of these things were taken. Here's another one seated on an arm. And so this pose, of which there are hundreds of examples of photographs in the archives at the Arizona Historical Society and other places that were actually published, became a kind of a thing, became a meme. And it became popular enough, and it became familiar as a kind of a convention of travel and tourism publicity. But the pose was applied to activities in other areas, even science. The visualization of end-of-life cactus care, for example, pictured the university botanists who had published theses on the so-called black spot disease, or simple necrosis, as they daubed bleach solution on the plants while seated in their arms. And whether clipped, padded, or tipped in, the saguaro became the lubricant of a distinctly modern Southwest into which anyone might climb. Ruth Egermeyer, the wife of the park superintendent of the Saguaro National Monument, posed as a park visitor in Arizona highways with a droop-armed saguaro, one of the oldest and most unusually formed specimens in the park. The photo of her leaning into the plant soon appeared on the cover of the park's 10-cent trail guide, inviting visitors. Come here, come closer, come see this thing. The visiting school teachers that you saw pictured in the Herbert's window feature turned up at the National Monument and soon appeared on a postcard. Taking up the suggestion, the sender of this postcard, writing to her mother in Iowa, asked, "Who has more fun than we do?" The tipping in of a saguaro on a Tucson golf course confirmed the saguaro's arrival as a symbol of post-war leisure and recreation. This is a detail from a Sunshine Climate Club ad in 1950 that was one of the ads that marked the club's return to national paid advertising. And it's set on the links of the Tucson Country Club. This scene, though, did not exist. It's completely manufactured, pretty much like one of those tall tale cards. And we know this because the picture had to be explained in advance to Tucsonans, including club members who may have wondered what was going on. Of course, the use of tipped-in photo elements to conjure up idealized settings was not new and was older than the cactus gag, but it was a gag nonetheless. And the caption simply explains that none of what you're looking at is real, it's completely manufactured. You can see they even added a little par 3 or par 4 sign down here, and all of these. I mean, what they did was they blotted out the course's oak trees. And this is what the course actually looked like at the time. So for the celebration of the golden anniversary of Arizona's statehood and the centennial of the founding of the territory in the years 1962-63, the design of a commemorative seal embraced the saguaro front and center and was evenly divided with the Grand Canyon, inverting the usual north-south orientation. Though the statewide commemoration was officially sanctioned, the special seal was the public-spirited contribution of an artist in the telephone directory department at Mountain Bell, who jettisoned the extractive iconography of the state seal, and you just completely dispense with that. Not to be outdone, the State Highway Department's 1962 roadmap took up the plastic techniques of commercial illustration. The map's cover featured a golden anniversary saguaro accompanied by gleaming chunks of gold beckoning in the sun without a miner or a pickaxe in sight. A suggestion, if one were needed, of the highly imaginative saguaro habitat that was about to unspool along the nation's highways. The largest specimen of its kind took root in Saugus, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, out on Route 128, seen here in an undated photograph by John Margolis. In looking at the roadside saguaro, it seems that the farther you get from its actual habitat, the more liberties may be taken in modeling the plant. In this case, the outsized scale necessary to support a giant sign that can be read at a distance. And while we may never be able to plot a direct connection between the publicity attending the celebration of Arizona's territorial and state semi-centennial in 1962-63, the dates of the motels and restaurants that choose saguaro theming will always be highly suggestive. But what's not in question is the power of saguaro iconography to conjure up, to boil down, and to distill the West into a single moment like this one. The owners of a roadside motel or restaurant often appear in the cards that they commission and freely give away as part of their advertising. And it's likely them, seated outside, contemplating their saguaro, sitting around, whiling away the afternoon like a bunch of latter-day John Russell Bartletts, only this time in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. and it's likely that that's their Cadillac too. Meanwhile, back in Tucson, the social saguaro was heightened with horseback rides, cowboys, Western wear, covered wagons, barbecues, bathing suits, swimming pools, often in the same frame. This is a postcard photo by the master, before mentioned Ray Manley. In Manley's oeuvre, there were two variations on the theme: the daytime horseback ride and pool party, and the nighttime campfire. For the Saddle and Surrey guest ranches owners, seen here in their matching red shirts and white cowboy hats, Manley sharpened up the drama with strobe lights concealed by the rocks of the fire ring. The first renderings of the Sonoran Desert in line drawings, engravings, and woodcuts, first-person encounters with transplanted saguaros in gardens from the Pacific coast to the nation's World's Fairs, shaped ideas about Arizona and the arid Southwest. Growing an imaginative and far-flung commercial range with the robust tourist trade after the Second World War, the saguaro became an iconic presence that framed the desert for fun in the sun, social engagement, and leisurely consumption. At this point, completing the picture, like the coupon, required very little imagination. Saguaro iconography is nothing if not an expression of a human relationship with a plant. Looking back on pictures of people posed with the saguaro, we can see and imagine our most playful and curious selves. We express ourselves. We stop, take stock, and touch in a saguaro moment. Now, since I wrote those closing lines for the book, I've come to believe that it's really the other way around. What's really going on in these pictures? These plants touch us. Thank you very much. And I welcome any comment that you may care to make.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was just so interesting. And I really enjoyed reading the book, and it was just exciting to see the pictures again and to hear you talking about it, Larry.
Thank you.
Let's see here. And I have a hard time. I'm not really good at multitasking. So talking and reading. Let's see here. But one of the questions, it says oops, it just moved. In early records of saguaros transplanted to exhibitions or botanical gardens, have you come across documentation of what sort of soil blend
No.
they used?
I've never seen that. I mean, but that doesn't mean that it's not there or that it doesn't exist. J.N. Rose's papers are at the Smithsonian, in the Smithsonian Library System. And I mean, it may be, I mean, I would start with somebody in the Department of Botany that has spent time, you know, with these legacy records. I mean, I would start with all the classical gardens, Shaw's, New York Botanical. But I'm sorry, I don't have information about the soils. I just assume that they would have brought it enough with them. But I mean, you saw the way that they packed that one plant, though. It's just a plant out of water, you know.
Mm-hmm. But they did put the brush and things around it to protect it.
And in other pictures I've seen of some installations, you know, World's Fairs, it's a sand pile. They bring in sand, and that's, you know, but what the composition, what the mix is, I don't know.
If they thought it needed.
Thank you so much for taking that on. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Do you know when the first transplanting started?
Well, as soon, you know, as a historian, you know, as soon as you say it started here, someone says, no, there was one the week before. But I believe that it's shortly after the railroad arrives here and it's coming, you know, it's Casa Grande down to Tucson. You've already scratched the outer edges of the Sonoran Desert, and things are being taken back to California, and they're trying to figure out what to do with them. I mean, and that's where this whole Arizona garden comes into being at the Hotel Del Monte. And it's really among the men, and it's men, who are the officers in the Southern Pacific Railroad who developed these gardens as this sort of unattainable, to the common person, exercise in conspicuous, consumption or transplantation or whatever you want to call it. Because once Chester Crocker had built the Del Monte Garden, his partner, Leland Stanford, wanted one. So they made a Stanford garden at Stanford's home, which is now on the campus at Stanford. And then they maintain it, but there are no saguaros. They do it with agaves, prickly pears, opuntias.
And do you think that the simplicity of the saguaro shape and its ease of analogizing the plant to a person have impacted the appeal as a symbol?
And you see this. Well, I mean, me personally, I always feel, that they're like waving at me. I mean, but in terms of, but that doesn't go far when you're trying to write about, and build a case that there is a certain anthropomorphic quality about this. So you see that in other images that come out all the time. Like I think I showed an early image of the Cactus Ballet, where a model is mimicking the arms of a plant. And people have been doing this forever. And there are also many photographs of people who have climbed up into the plants, that are standing in the plants. They maybe have not made any plans to sit in the plants, but they're nevertheless, there's a ladder or evidence of how they get up there. And people just can't get close enough to this, which I think is one of the compelling, that was what kind of got me started with that magazine cover. I mean, I had been here and seen the plants, but I had never seen the way that they had been pictured, and like, where did this picture come from? But it totally gets into the anthropomorphic quality that people project onto them, touching, poking, hitting the spine, yeah.
And that actually brings us right to the next question, which is, do you know how they were able to sit on an arm? Did they pad the seat or cut off the spines?
Well, in terms of the what did I do with that magazine? In terms of the particular one that I was just talking about, I mean, you can tell when the plants get old, they do tend to lose spines, at the base of the plant. But I think what's happening here is they're just being loved to death with attention. Well, let's call it loads of attention. They've taken this picture before, and so spines, I don't have evidence where anybody says, well, we need to go out and we're going to cut the spines off this plant so we could sit in it. It's more like, okay, they're not going to tell anybody what they're doing, but they end up taking a board and posing a model sitting on a barrel, or they don't seem to have any hesitation of maybe cutting off a section of the barrel, to put the board on it, to sit on it, And in the book, there's this, to me, it's a hilarious picture of them posing a model in this elegant formal gown, seated in the middle of the Huntington's golden barrel collection. It's like literally, and you kind of wonder, is there another photo that shows the structure that's under that, what she's actually sitting on, But the reason, Bill Stanton when he saw the picture, he told me that the Huntington had tried for years to cultivate saguaros and they couldn't do it. And so they fell back on the golden barrel that they sort of single-handedly rescued from oblivion, being trucked out of Mexico, and they began to cultivate them and they became known as the golden barrel. And so that makes sense why they would elevate them to that kind of a get up with a fashion model in a formal gown sitting. Just again, it goes back to this anthropomorphic quality. these things touch us, you know.
It's true. Well, thank you, Jack, for covering that. I lost my connection for a few minutes, but then
Oh,
it
no,
came
no worries,
back.
no worries. So the next question there was the painting you showed a few slides of, was that a watercolor, and did that artist illustrate other cacti species?
Well, Mary Emily Eaton is probably one of the most renowned botanical illustrators. And she had a residency at the New York Botanical Garden in 1912. And she painted, I don't know if she's the exclusive artist for Cactaceae, the Britton and Rose book, but she contributed, you know, tons of artworks, and that are now the plates of record, you know, for that. But that is a watercolor. And there's a funny story that goes with that. You know, I wasn't expecting to publish anything other than that plate that you see all the time, you know, that color plate. And I called up my friends in the Smithsonian libraries and I said, I would just like a scan, or, you know, could you scan that image for me with they have a book scanner, you know, that kind of thing. And they said, well, wait, we're supposed to have the original art for that. And I was like, what? And then they said words that, you know, if you work in a museum or a library, you're never supposed to hear, which is, but we can't find it. You know, because they post, the Museum of Natural History, they post all of their art online, and it's not online. And they called me a couple of days later. They said, we found it. It was on someone's office wall, framed on someone's wall in their office. And so I had Alice Tangerini, their great botanical artist. She made the scan of that Mary Emily Eaton thing, and we put it on the back cover of the book. You know, so yeah, I love that. I love that image. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great one. And this is actually a fairly important question. In the early years of studying the saguaros and other cacti, did they ever talk to the native residents who have lived with the cacti for hundreds of years?
The record on that is quite mixed, and I would say it's pretty spotty. No, I would say no. And it's an interesting, you should talk to Ben Wilder about this. I mean, he is determined to write the history of the Tana Atom back into Tumamoc Hill, because when they began the Carnegie Institution, of course, and Daniel McDougall, William Cannon, they're charged with writing up and describing the significance of the hill. And they do it solely on botanical terms. They don't mention, but they do correspond back and forth about, you know, I found pot shards. I found, you know, petroglyphs. This seems to be the remnants of an Indian village on top of the peak. And it never goes anywhere. And in fact, when William Cannon, who's the first resident investigator who goes there, he begins to document the property with his camera. He finds a fruit harvest pole that was presumably left for the season, and he just launches it into the ground and uses it as a boundary corner marker and takes a picture. So there's very little interest. I mean, there is acknowledgement among people who travel through the desert, through the Gila River Valley, of the fruit harvest and the sustaining, you know, qualities of this plant that's responsible for life, you know, as it exists there. But one of the problems is, if you don't hit the fruit seed, if you don't hit that season, you might not even be aware of it, really, or that the plants flower at all. And for the longest time, that was one of the cases. I mean, Emery never pictures a flowering saguaro, ever. Although they eventually, you know, get around to doing it. How can they not?
Right.
But yeah, but the business of, you know, discussing with Indians, and, you know, It hardly, it happens by happenstance, by accident almost.
And I'll skip ahead of the next question, which I'll get back to. But Lynn commented that in the same vein, it's interesting that so few of the depictions show the plant in flower or fruit. It's always the
Right.
vegetative shape that is being iconized. And then we have a question from Rex Graham. It's interesting that the photos don't show any woodpecker holes. Too messy, I guess. So kind of a question comment. And then from Barry, do you know if the hole is still at Papago Park? Presumably referring to the hole in the rock.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's still there. Of course, it's there.
Cool.
Yeah, it's worth a visit. It's let me see. If you're going to the Desert Botanical Garden, it's not part of that complex. It's off on its own. I think it's closer to the zoo. But if you Google it, you can very easily find it. And there are people hanging out there all, hours of the day, all times. It's something you have to see, I think.
Cool. And that's great. That's all the questions we have. Again, if you did want to throw that book link into the chat,
Oh, okay.
that might be helpful. Just a reminder, this book is available for download or purchase, which again is just fantastic. And again, Larry, just thank you so much for your presentation this evening. I think we all saw some incredible photos, and it gets me really excited for hopefully a good saguaro bloom this year.
I hope so. Thank you, Jack and Susie and everyone. Thank you so much.
All right. And we will be back next month. Just look out for the e-blast that will come at you in a few weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, good night.
Good night.